sold your house," my mother announced casually over our weekly family brunch, her voice slicing through the peaceful Sunday morning like a chainsaw through silk. "For Natasha's wedding, of course." The fork slipped from my numb fingers and clattered against my plate. "Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." My father nodded beside her, as if they'd just mentioned the weather, while my younger sister Natasha practically glowed with excitement across the table, her new engagement ring catching the sunlight streaming through the restaurant windows. The words echoed in my head like a bad dream I couldn't wake up from. Atis. My house, the 3-bedroom colonial in Millbrook Heights that I'd been paying the mortgage on for the past 4 years. The house I'd saved every penny to buy after college, working double shifts at the marketing firm just to afford the down payment. The house where I'd planned to build my future. "You sold my what?" I managed to whisper, my voice barely audible over the clinking of silverware from other tables at Romano's Bistro, our usual Sunday spot in downtown Cedarville. "Now don't get dramatic, Vivienne," my mother, Patricia Clearwater, said with that dismissive wave of her manicured hand that I'd grown to despise over my 32 years of life. "You'll understand when you hear about the wedding plans. Natasha deserves a fairy tale and this venue she's found." She clasped her hands together like she was discussing winning the lottery. "LaBeouf." I stared at them, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. "My name is Vivienne Clearwater, and I work as a senior marketing strategist at Pinnacle Communications here in Cedarville, Ohio. I've spent the last decade building a stable career and a life I could be proud of, while watching my parents bend over backward to make every dream come true for my 27-year-old sister. But this was beyond anything I could have imagined in my worst nightmares. The Rosewood Manor," Natasha gushed, leaning forward eagerly. "Viv, you should see it. It's like something out of a movie. Marble staircases, crystal chandeliers, gardens that go on for miles. The ballroom can hold 300 guests. 300 guests. I did quick math in my head and felt sick. My modest salary barely covered my mortgage, car payment, and living expenses. The house I'd worked so hard for was my biggest asset, my security, my future, and they just sold it. "How much are we talking about?" I asked quietly, though I already suspected the answer would destroy me. "The wedding will cost around $120,000, my mother said proudly, dabbing her lips with her cloth napkin. "Nothing but the best for our Natasha. Your house should cover it perfectly. Plus give us a little extra for the honeymoon in Tuscany. $120,000 for one day." Meanwhile, I'd been living paycheck to paycheck, carefully budgeting every dollar to make my mortgage payments, skipping vacations and new clothes just to keep my head above water. The house that represented 4 years of sacrifice, of eating ramen noodles and driving a 10-year-old Honda just so I could afford the payments. "And you've already decided this?" I asked, my voice eerily calm, despite the rage building in my chest like a pressure cooker about to explode. "Of course, sweetheart." My father, Robert Clearwater, said matter-of-factly. "Family comes first, Vivienne. You understand that. Besides, you can always find another place to rent. But Natasha only gets married once." I wanted to laugh. Or scream. Maybe both. They hadn't asked for my opinion. They hadn't even told me they were thinking about it. They'd simply decided that my life, my security, my future, was disposable for Natasha's dream wedding. "How exactly did you sell my house?" I asked slowly, each word deliberate. "Well, technically we're still on the deed from when we co-signed your mortgage," my father explained, as if this made perfect sense. "The real estate market is so hot right now, and when we saw what Natasha's dream wedding would cost, it just made sense financially." My blood turned to ice. When I'd bought the house 4 years ago, my credit wasn't quite strong enough to qualify for the full mortgage amount on my own. My parents had agreed to co-sign, supposedly to help me build equity and establish myself. I'd been making every single payment on time, never missing one, treating it like the sacred responsibility it was. I never imagined they'd use that co-signature to literally steal my home from under me. "When did you put it on the market?" I managed to ask. "Last month," Natasha chimed in cheerfully. "We got 3 offers in the first week. The buyers are paying $15,000 over asking price. Isn't that amazing?" Last month. They'd been planning this for an entire month without saying a word to me. I'd been going to work every day, making my mortgage payment, tending to my small garden, completely oblivious that my own family was orchestrating the destruction of my life behind my back. "Where am I supposed to live?" I asked, though I had a sinking feeling I already knew the answer. "Well, you can move back in with us temporarily," my mother said brightly. "Just until you find a nice apartment somewhere. It'll be like old times." Old times. When I was 18 and desperate to escape their suffocating favoritism toward Natasha. When every accomplishment of mine was overshadowed by whatever Natasha needed or wanted. When I was expected to be grateful for the scraps of attention they threw my way. "The closing is in 3 weeks," my father added, checking his phone. "The buyers want to move in quickly, so you'll need to start packing soon. But don't worry, we've already cleared out your old bedroom for you." They'd already cleared out my childhood bedroom. They'd been so confident that I'd just go along with their plans, so sure that I'd sacrifice my independence and crawl back home like a kicked dog. I looked around the table at my family. My parents beaming with pride at their generous gesture toward their favorite daughter, Natasha practically bouncing with wedding excitement, all of them completely oblivious to the fact that they'd just destroyed my life for a party. But as I sat there, processing the magnitude of what they'd done, something cold and calculating began to form in my mind. They thought they could just take everything I'd worked for and expect me to smile and say thank you. They thought I'd be the same compliant, accommodating Vivienne who'd spent her whole life making herself smaller so Natasha could shine brighter. They were wrong. See, what my family didn't know was that I'd been managing my parents' retirement portfolio for the past 2 years. They'd asked me to handle it because, in their words, I was so good with numbers and financial planning. I had full access to their accounts, complete control over their investments, and their total trust. That trust was about to be the biggest mistake of their lives. I smiled and nodded as they continued chattering about wedding plans and how grateful I should be to contribute to Natasha's special day. But inside, I was already planning exactly how I was going to watch their world crumble the same way they'd just crushed mine. "Well," I said finally, my voice steady and calm, "I guess we'll see how this all works out." They had no idea what was coming. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Growing up in the Clearwater household was like living in a house with an invisible hierarchy that everyone understood but no one talked about. I was the reliable one, the self-sufficient daughter who could handle herself, while Natasha was the precious princess who needed constant attention, financial support, and emotional validation. From the time I was 12 years old, I was folding laundry, helping with dinner, and maintaining perfect grades while Natasha got to focus on being a kid. When she struggled in math, my parents hired a private tutor at $60 an hour. When I struggled with chemistry, they told me to ask my teacher for extra help during lunch breaks. The pattern continued through high school. Natasha wanted to join the competitive dance team? My parents immediately signed her up for private lessons and bought hundreds of dollars worth of costumes and competition fees. When I wanted to take AP classes to improve my college chances, they said the textbooks were too expensive and I should just work harder with what I had. College was where the disparity became impossible to ignore. Natasha received a full ride from the bank of mom and dad to Westfield University, where she majored in communications and minored in sorority life. Her dorm room looked like a luxury apartment, complete with a new laptop, designer bedding, and a monthly allowance that exceeded what most people made at part-time jobs. Meanwhile, I worked 3 jobs to pay for my education at Cedarville State. I cleaned office buildings at 5 in the morning, worked at the campus bookstore between classes, and tutored struggling students at night. My parents' contribution to my education? They co-signed my student loans and told me they were proud of my independence and work ethic. By the time I graduated, Natasha had a communications degree she'd never used and was living back at home finding herself, while I had a marketing degree, 6 years of work experience, and a mountain of student debt that would take me a decade to pay off. But I was determined to build something for myself. I landed an entry-level position at Pinnacle Communications right here in Cedarville, starting at $32,000 a year. It wasn't much, but it was mine. I rented a tiny studio apartment on Maple Street, furnished it with second-hand finds from garage sales, and slowly worked my way up the corporate ladder. Every promotion was earned through late nights and weekend projects. Every raise was the result of exceeded targets and innovative campaigns. After 6 years, I'd worked my way up to senior marketing strategist, earning a respectable $78,000 a year. Not wealthy by any means, but enough to start thinking about building a real life. That's when I decided to buy a house. The 3-bedroom colonial on Elmwood Drive in Millbrook Heights wasn't anything fancy, but it had good bones and a small backyard where I could plant a garden. The asking price was $185,000. With my savings, I could afford a decent down payment, but my credit history wasn't quite strong enough to qualify for the full mortgage amount on my own. When I approached my parents about co-signing, they seemed genuinely proud. "Look at our Vivienne," my mother had said, "buying her own house at 28. We raised such a responsible daughter." The co-signing process was straightforward. They attended the closing, signed the papers, and I handed over the keys to my future. What I didn't fully understand at the time was that their names would remain on the deed, giving them legal ownership rights that I never imagined they'd abuse. For 4 years, I'd been making every mortgage payment religiously. Never late, never short, never missed. I treated that house like the sanctuary it was. I painted the walls in colors I loved, planted tomatoes and herbs in the backyard, and slowly furnished each room with pieces I'd saved up to buy. I hosted exactly 3 dinner parties in 4 years, because I was so careful with my budget. Every dollar was accounted for. Mortgage payment, utilities, car payment, groceries, student loans, and a small emergency fund that I'd been building dollar by dollar. Meanwhile, Natasha had been floating through life like a dandelion seed on the wind. After college, she'd lived at home for 2 years, while exploring her options. Then she moved to Nashville for 6 months to pursue music, which lasted until she realized she actually had to practice and perform. Next came a brief stint as a yoga instructor, followed by an even briefer attempt at running an online boutique selling jewelry she bought wholesale and marked up 300%. Through all of these career experiments, my parents provided financial support, emotional encouragement, and a safety net that seemed to have no bottom. When her music career failed, they paid for her to move back home. When the yoga studio folded, they covered her credit card debt. When the jewelry business collapsed, they funded her next adventure. 6 months ago, that adventure became Jeremy Hawthorne, a construction manager she'd met at a coffee shop in downtown Cedarville. Jeremy seemed like a decent enough guy, steady job, owned his own truck, treated Natasha well. But 6 months of dating hardly seemed like enough time to plan a $120,000 wedding. Not that anyone asked for my opinion. The engagement happened fast. Jeremy proposed at Christmas with a ring that must have cost him several months' salary. Natasha said yes before he'd even finished the question. My parents were over the moon, immediately diving into wedding planning with the enthusiasm of people who'd been waiting their whole lives for this moment. "Our baby girl is getting married," my mother had gushed at our January family dinner. "We need to start planning immediately. This is going to be the wedding of the century." I'd smiled and offered congratulations, never imagining that their wedding enthusiasm would translate into selling my house without my knowledge or consent. I'd been focused on my own life, working on a major campaign for our biggest client, and considering whether I might finally be ready to start dating again after my last relationship ended badly 2 years ago. While I was building spreadsheets and managing budgets, my family was apparently building plans to destroy everything I'd worked for. Bayer. The most bitter irony? 2 years ago, when my parents started struggling to manage their retirement investments, they'd asked me to take over their portfolio management. "You're so good with financial planning, Vivienne," my father had said. "We trust you completely with this." I'd agreed because I wanted to help them secure their future. I'd spent hours researching investment strategies, rebalancing their portfolios, and growing their retirement accounts from $200,000 to nearly $400,000 over the past 2 years. I'd literally doubled their retirement savings through careful planning and smart investments. And now they were using the house I'd worked myself to exhaustion to afford as collateral for their favorite daughter's fantasy wedding. But they'd made one crucial mistake in their calculations. They'd forgotten that the person they'd just betrayed was the same person who held complete control over their financial future. As I sat in that restaurant, watching them plan Natasha's dream wedding with my money, I was already calculating exactly how much their betrayal was going to cost them. They wanted to play games with my security? Fine. Friedis ta. Let's see how they liked playing with theirs. Friedis ta. The rest of that Sunday brunch passed in a blur of wedding details that felt like daggers to my heart. As my family chattered excitedly about flower arrangements and menu tastings, I sat there calculating the true magnitude of what they'd done to me. Every detail they shared made the situation worse. "The venue requires a $50,000 deposit by next Friday," Natasha explained, practically bouncing in her seat. "And then we have the catering. Jeremy's family is huge, so we're looking at nearly 300 guests now. The menu alone is going to be $35,000. 300 guests. I did quick math and felt my stomach drop further. When they'd first mentioned this insane wedding, I'd assumed we were talking about a typical celebration. Maybe 75 people, a nice reception hall, reasonable costs. But this wasn't a wedding, it was a production. "What about your dress?" my mother asked, her eyes sparkling with the kind of excitement I'd never seen directed toward any of my accomplishments. "Oh, Patricia, you're going to die when you see it," Natasha gushed, using my mother's first name the way she always did, like they were best friends instead of mother and daughter. "It's a custom design for Monique's bridal boutique. $8,000, but it's absolutely perfect. Hand-beaded, cathedral-length train, the works. $8,000 for a dress she'd wear for one day." I calculated quickly. That was more than I spent on clothing in 2 years. My entire professional wardrobe had been built piece by piece from clearance racks and end-of-season sales. "And the photography?" my father prompted, pulling out his phone to take notes like he was planning a military operation. "We hired Westbrook Studios," Jeremy chimed in, speaking for the first time since they dropped their bombshell about my house. "They did the Morrison wedding last year. You know, the one that was featured in Southern Bride magazine? $12,000 for the full package, but they're absolutely worth it. $12,000 for photographs." I owned a perfectly good camera that I'd bought secondhand for $300 and had been using to document my own life for years. But apparently, only the best was acceptable for Princess Natasha. "Tell her about the flowers," my mother urged, as if she was directing a play and wanted to make sure all the crucial scenes were performed. "Rosewood Manor has these incredible gardens, but we want to enhance them," Natasha explained, her hands gesturing wildly as she spoke. "White roses, peonies, baby's breath, cascading arrangements for the ceremony space, centerpieces for each table, a floral arch for the altar. Enchanted Gardens is handling everything for $18,000. $18,000 for flowers that would be dead within a week." I thought about the small herb garden I'd lovingly cultivated in my backyard, how I'd researched each plant, carefully tended them through seasons, and felt genuine pride when my basil and tomatoes flourished. Those flowers cost more than I made in 4 months. "What about the music?" I heard myself ask, though I wasn't sure why I was torturing myself with more details. "Live orchestra for the ceremony, DJ for the reception. Jeremy said proudly, plus a jazz quartet for the cocktail hour. The whole entertainment package is $15,000, but Natasha deserves to walk down the aisle to live music. I had walked across the stage at my college graduation to recorded music played through a crackling sound system. But then again, my accomplishments had never warranted live orchestras. As they continued rattling off expenses, transportation for the wedding party, professional hair and makeup, custom invitations, a videographer, specialty linens, I began to understand that they hadn't just sold my house for a wedding. They'd sold it for a fantasy production that would cost more than most people's annual salaries. "How much is Jeremy's family contributing?" I asked, genuinely curious about whether I was the only one being financially sacrificed for this extravaganza. "Well, traditionally the bride's family handles most of the wedding costs," my mother said as if she was quoting ancient law. "Jeremy's parents are covering the rehearsal dinner and the honeymoon, which is very generous of them." Generous. They were paying for one dinner and a vacation while my parents liquidated my house for the main event. The math was becoming clear, and it was nauseating. "And speaking of the honeymoon," Natasha continued, oblivious to my growing horror, "we're doing 3 weeks in Italy. Rome, Florence, the Amalfi Coast, and then finishing in Tuscany. Jeremy's parents found this incredible villa rental for the last week. 3 weeks in Italy. I'd never taken a vacation longer than 4 days because I couldn't afford to lose the income or pay for extended travel. My last vacation had been a weekend camping trip to Lake Erie that cost me less than $200 total. The timing is perfect," my father added, checking his calendar on his phone. "The house closing is scheduled for March 15th, which gives us plenty of time to cover all the wedding deposits and still have everything ready for the June ceremony." March 15th. 3 weeks away. They'd not only sold my house without telling me, they'd planned the timeline to ensure I had no opportunity to stop it. The buyers had probably already secured their financing, completed their inspections, and were making their own plans to move into my home. "Have you told the buyers that someone is currently living in the house?" I asked, wondering if they'd at least had the courtesy to mention that detail. "Oh, don't worry about that," my mother waved dismissively. "We explained that our daughter would be moving out before closing. They're fine with it. Actually, they're excited to take possession quickly because they have children starting at Millbrook Elementary in the fall." Children. A family was planning to move into my house, probably imagining their kids playing in the backyard where I'd spent countless hours gardening and dreaming about my own future. They had no idea that the house was being sold out from under someone who'd never agreed to the sale. "What exactly did you tell them about the living situation?" I pressed, needing to understand just how thoroughly they'd planned my displacement. "Just that you'd been staying there temporarily and would be moving back home with us," my father explained matter-of-factly. "Nothing complicated. Clean transition for everyone involved. Staying there temporarily." They'd rewritten history to make it sound like I'd been house-sitting instead of making mortgage payments and building equity for 4 years. In their narrative, I was just a temporary occupant who could be easily relocated, not the legal resident whose financial sacrifices had made the house possible. "And you're confident that a $120,000 wedding is a reasonable investment?" I asked, still trying to process the sheer audacity of their decision. "Investment?" Natasha laughed like I'd said something adorable but naive. "Viv, it's not an investment, it's my wedding day. You can't put a price on making dreams come true. But apparently you could put my house as collateral for making those dreams reality." "Besides," my mother added, "we got such a good price for the house, $215,000, which is 15 over asking. After paying off the remaining mortgage balance, we'll have exactly what we need for the wedding, plus a little extra for emergencies." I felt the blood drain from my face. The remaining mortgage balance was only about $60,000. That meant they'd have roughly $155,000 in cash from the sale of my house. They were planning to spend nearly every penny of that money on one day, leaving themselves with virtually nothing afterward. "What about after the wedding?" I asked quietly. "What's your plan for housing, retirement, emergencies?" My parents exchanged a look I couldn't quite interpret. It was the same look they'd shared when I'd asked uncomfortable questions as a child, like when I'd wondered why Natasha got to go to summer camp while I got to stay home and help with yard work. "We'll figure that out later," my father said finally. "Right now, we're focused on giving Natasha the perfect wedding. Everything else can wait." Everything else, including their financial security, my housing situation, and any semblance of family respect or consideration. As we finally left the restaurant that afternoon, I realized they hadn't just sold my house. They'd sold my security, my independence, my carefully built life, and my trust in them as a family. They'd traded my future for Natasha's fantasy, and they expected me to be grateful for the privilege of contributing to her happiness. But what they didn't know was that I had just spent 2 hours listening to them plan their own financial destruction. And unlike them, when I made plans, I followed through completely. Driving home from that devastating brunch, memories flooded back like a dam bursting. Every instance of favoritism, every time I'd been overlooked, every moment I'd swallowed my disappointment and convinced myself it was normal. But sitting in my car outside my doomed house, I finally saw the pattern clearly for what it was: a lifetime of conditioning me to accept being disposable. The earliest memory that crystallized was from when I was 14 and Natasha was 9. I'd been saving babysitting money for months to buy a guitar, dreaming of joining the school's music program. I'd researched models, compared prices, and finally had enough for a decent acoustic guitar from Miller's Music Store. The day I planned to make the purchase, Natasha mentioned wanting to try dance lessons. Within hours, my parents had enrolled her in Miss Beverly's Academy of Dance at $200 a month, plus costume fees, recital expenses, and competition costs. When I asked about my guitar money, they explained that Natasha's dance lessons were an investment in her development, while my guitar was just a hobby. They suggested I keep saving and maybe ask for it for Christmas. Christmas came and went. Natasha got a professional dance bag, new shoes, and a private lesson package. I got a $20 gift card to the bookstore and a lecture about being grateful for what I had. High school brought more of the same systematic inequality. When Natasha struggled with algebra in 8th grade, my parents immediately hired Mrs. Henderson, the best math tutor in Cedarville, at $75 an hour. She received tutoring twice a week for an entire school year, plus they bought her a graphing calculator and specialized workbooks. Meanwhile, when I was struggling with advanced chemistry as a junior, a Class 1 needed to pass to qualify for the pre-med track I was considering, my parents told me to form a study group with classmates or ask my teacher for extra help during lunch. When I pointed out that Natasha was getting professional help for basic math while I was drowning in advanced science, they said it was different because Natasha wasn't naturally academic like I was. Being naturally academic, apparently, meant I didn't deserve academic support. The college years were when the disparity became impossible to ignore or rationalize. Natasha's acceptance to Westfield University was celebrated with a family dinner at the fanciest restaurant in town. They gave her a brand new laptop, a car upgrade, and a credit card for emergencies that seemed to have no limit. Her dorm room was a showcase: matching bedding sets, a mini fridge, a coffee maker, decorative pillows, artwork for the walls, and enough clothes to stock a small boutique. When I was accepted to Cedarville State with partial academic scholarships, my parents took me to Applebee's and told me how proud they were of my independence and resourcefulness. My dorm room was furnished with hand-me-downs from garage sales and whatever I could afford from my summer job at the grocery store. The most painful memory was from my sophomore year. I'd been working 25 hours a week while carrying a full course load, trying to minimize my student loan debt. My grades were suffering, and I was exhausted constantly. I'd called home in tears one evening, explaining that I was struggling to balance everything, and asking if they might be able to help with just my textbook cost for one semester. "Vivienne, honey," my mother had said in that patronizing tone I'd learned to dread, You're doing so well managing on your own, we don't want to interfere with your independence. Besides, Natasha's tuition just went up, and she needs a new meal plan. Natasha's tuition. For a communications major who spent more time planning sorority events than attending classes, while I was killing myself trying to maintain a 3.8 GPA in marketing and business administration. That same semester, Natasha called home crying because she'd maxed out her emergency credit card shopping for sorority formal dresses. My parents not only paid off the entire $2,000 balance, but increased her monthly allowance so it wouldn't happen again. The post-college years continued the pattern with surgical precision. When Natasha graduated and moved back home to find her direction, my parents converted their home office into a luxury bedroom for her, complete with new furniture and a 60-inch television. When I graduated and moved into my tiny studio apartment, they visited once, made polite comments about how cozy it was, and left after 30 minutes. Natasha's failed music career in Nashville was funded entirely by the bank of mom and dad. They paid for her apartment, her demo recording sessions, her promotional materials, even her wardrobe for performances that rarely materialized. When that dream died, they flew to Nashville to help her pack and move home, then took her on a recovery vacation to help her process the disappointment. When my long-term relationship with David ended badly 2 years ago, leaving me emotionally devastated and financially strained because we'd been splitting rent on a nicer apartment, I called my parents for support. They listened politely and suggested I keep busy with work to get over it. No offer of help with the suddenly doubled rent, no invitation to stay with them temporarily, no emotional support beyond a generic, "these things happen" response. The yoga instructor phase brought more financial support for Natasha, equipment, training certifications, studio space rental, marketing materials. When that venture failed after 6 months, they covered her losses and helped her transition to the next attempt at finding herself. My own career struggles were met with very different responses. When I was passed over for a promotion I'd worked toward for 18 months, my parents' advice was to work harder and prove yourself more clearly. When Natasha's jewelry business failed because she'd never learned basic accounting or customer service skills, they covered her debts and praised her for, quote, having the courage to be an entrepreneur. The most telling incident had happened just last year. I'd been dealing with a serious health scare, some concerning test results that required follow-up specialists, and expensive diagnostic procedures. My insurance covered most of it, but the co-pays and deductibles were stretching my budget thin. When I mentioned this during a family dinner, they expressed sympathy, but offered no assistance. 2 weeks later, Natasha mentioned wanting to redecorate her bedroom again. Within days, they'd given her $3,000 for new furniture, curtains, and accessories, because her room needed updating, and they wanted her to feel comfortable and happy at home. I'd been handling serious health concerns with no family support, while Natasha got thousands of dollars for decorative pillows. But perhaps the most insidious part of this pattern was how they'd trained me to accept it. Every time I felt hurt or overlooked, they had explanations that sounded almost reasonable. Natasha needed more help because she was more sensitive. I got less support because I was more capable. They spent more money on her because she was still finding her way, while I was already successful and independent. They'd convinced me that being competent meant being invisible, that needing help was a character flaw, that asking for support was selfish when other family members needed it more. I had internalized these messages so completely that when they asked me to manage their retirement accounts 2 years ago, I'd felt honored. Finally, they recognized my financial skills and trusted me with something important. I'd thrown myself into researching investment strategies, rebalancing portfolios, and maximizing their returns. In 2 years, I'd grown their retirement savings from $200,000 to nearly $400,000. I'd spent countless hours monitoring markets, adjusting allocations, and ensuring their financial security. They'd praised my work and expressed gratitude for my expertise. I'd been so focused on proving my value through competence that I'd never stopped to ask why I was the only family member expected to prove my worth constantly. Sitting in my car that Sunday afternoon, staring at the house I was about to lose, I finally understood the complete picture. They'd spent 32 years conditioning me to accept scraps while Natasha received banquets. They'd trained me to be grateful for being overlooked and to view my own needs as less important than everyone else's wants. They'd created a family dynamic where I existed to serve their favorite child's dreams. And they'd done it so skillfully that I'd participated willingly for decades. But they'd made one crucial miscalculation in their grand plan. The same financial skills they'd relied on to grow their retirement savings were about to be turned against them. The daughter they'd taught to be invisible was about to make sure they never overlooked her again. And the best part? They'd never see it coming because they'd spent so many years assuming I'd always be there to clean up their messes and fund their mistakes. That assumption was about to cost them everything. Monday morning arrived with the subtlety of a freight train. I was barely halfway through my first cup of coffee when my doorbell rang at 7:30 a.m. Through the peephole, I saw my mother standing on my front porch with what appeared to be enough luggage for a month-long expedition, while my father wrestled with folding tables from his car trunk. "Surprise!" my mother chirped when I opened the door, pushing past me with an armload of hanging clothes. "We thought we'd get an early start on moving in. There's so much wedding planning to do, and it'll be so much easier if we're all under one roof." I stood in my own doorway, still in my pajamas, watching my parents transform my peaceful morning routine into a three-ring circus. Behind my father, I could see Natasha's car pulling into my driveway, loaded with boxes and what looked like an entire office setup. "Wait," I said, my brain struggling to process what was happening. "Moving in? Today? I thought we said I'd move out by March 15th. "Well, that's still the plan," my father explained, hauling in a folding table that looked suspiciously like the one from their dining room. "But we figured it would be more efficient if we set up our wedding planning headquarters here. That way, we can coordinate everything while you're packing up." Wedding planning headquarters. In my house. The house they'd sold without telling me. Natasha bounded through my front door carrying a laptop bag and what appeared to be 3 different wedding planning binders. "Viv, this is going to be so fun! It's like a family slumber party, except we're planning the most important day of my life." Within an hour, my home was unrecognizable. My dining room table had been pushed against the wall to make room for their folding table, which was now covered with wedding venue brochures, fabric samples, and multiple phones connecting them to various vendors. My living room had become a storage area for dress bags, shoe boxes, and sample centerpieces that Natasha insisted on visualizing in different lighting. My kitchen counter, where I normally ate my quiet breakfast while reviewing my work schedule, was now command central for catering coordination. My mother had spread out menus from 3 different catering companies, complete with handwritten notes about dietary restrictions for guests I'd never met. "We're meeting with the florist at 10, my mother announced, consulting a schedule she'd apparently created without input from anyone who actually lived in the house. Then lunch with the photographer at noon, cake tasting at 2, and the band auditions at 4. Band auditions. In my living room. On a Monday when I had 3 client presentations to prepare for. "Where exactly am I supposed to work?" I asked, staring at my displaced home office setup. My desk had been moved to accommodate a dress-fitting area, complete with a 3-way mirror they'd somehow transported from Natasha's bedroom at home. "You can use the kitchen table," Natasha suggested cheerfully, gesturing toward the 2-foot space that wasn't covered with wedding planning materials. "Or the bedroom? It'll be like studying in college again." I had never studied in my bedroom in college because I'd shared it with a roommate and had barely enough space for my textbooks, much less a proper work area. But apparently, my current living situation was less important than Natasha's dress-fitting convenience. The florist appointment turned my living room into a botanical showcase. Patricia Hendricks from Enchanted Gardens arrived with samples of every white flower known to humanity, spreading them across my coffee table, my couch, and even my bookshelves. The smell was overwhelming, and I started sneezing almost immediately. "Oh, you're not allergic, are you?" Patricia asked with concern, noting my watery eyes and runny nose. "Just a mild sensitivity," I managed, reaching for tissues while trying to breathe through my mouth. "Don't worry," my mother said dismissively. "Vivienne will be fine. She can take some Benadryl if needed. Now, tell us more about the peony and rose combination for the altar arrangements." Benadryl. So I could be drugged into tolerance while they filled my home with allergens for their planning convenience. The photographer meeting was even worse. Marcus Williamson from Westbrook Studios arrived with portfolio books, sample albums, and a laptop for showing video presentations. He needed to clear a large space to properly display his work, so my living room furniture was rearranged again, this time pushing my reading chair into the corner and moving my bookshelf to create a makeshift presentation area. "This lighting is perfect," Marcus commented, opening my curtains wider and adjusting my blinds. "Mind if I move this lamp? It's creating a shadow on my display area." My lamp. The one I'd saved for 3 months to buy, chosen specifically to create warm reading light in the evenings. It was now banished to the hallway because it interfered with wedding photography presentations. Lunch was delivered to my house because leaving would have interrupted their momentum. 3 different catering companies sent sample menus and food tastings, transforming my kitchen into a restaurant testing ground. My refrigerator was stuffed with labeled containers of appetizers, entrees, and dessert samples, leaving no room for my actual groceries. "Try the salmon Wellington," my mother urged, handing me a fork while I stood in my own kitchen like a visitor. "It's divine, but we're worried about the cost per plate." I took a polite bite while calculating that the salmon Wellington cost more per serving than I typically spent on dinner for 3 days. But, apparently, cost was only a concern in terms of maximizing guests served, not total expenditure. The cake tasting appointment brought Delilah Martinez from Sweet Dreams Bakery, who arrived with a rolling cart containing 12 different cake samples, 3 varieties of frosting, and an entire binder of wedding cake photographs. My kitchen counter became a dessert testing laboratory, with plates, forks, and notebooks scattered across every available surface. "The traditional vanilla with raspberry filling is lovely," Delilah explained, cutting generous slices for everyone to sample. "But the chocolate ganache with salted caramel is really having a moment right now." I watched my family sample cake after cake while I tried to find space to make myself a simple sandwich for lunch. Every time I reached for a cabinet or drawer, someone needed access to the same area for wedding planning purposes. By 3 o'clock, my house felt like a wedding planning factory. Every room had been repurposed, every surface covered with materials related to Natasha's big day. The smell of flowers was giving me a persistent headache, the constant rearranging of furniture was making navigation impossible, and the non-stop vendor meetings were creating noise levels that made concentration impossible. I tried to retreat to my bedroom to prepare for my own work presentations, but even that space had been compromised. Natasha had hung 3 potential bridesmaid dresses on my closet door for comparison purposes, and my dresser was now displaying jewelry options and hair accessory samples. "Don't mind the mess," Natasha said brightly, peeking into my bedroom where I was attempting to review client files. "I just need to see how these earrings look with different lighting throughout the day." My bedroom window apparently provided optimal earring viewing conditions. The band auditions began at 4 o'clock sharp, turning my living room into a concert venue. 3 different musical groups rotated through my space, each requiring different electrical setups and acoustic arrangements. My neighbors probably thought I was hosting some kind of music festival. Mammy. The jazz quartet was sophisticated and pleasant. The acoustic duo was romantic and charming. The classic rock cover band was loud enough to wake the dead and seemed completely inappropriate for a wedding ceremony, but Natasha was apparently considering them for, quote, cocktail hour energy. "Can you turn up the volume?" she called out during their rendition of Sweet Child O' Mine. "I want to make sure it carries over conversation." They turned up the volume. In my living room. At 5 o'clock on a Monday afternoon. By evening, I felt like a refugee in my own home. Every space had been claimed for wedding purposes, every surface covered with materials I couldn't move or disturb. My normal routine of quiet dinners while catching up on industry news had been replaced by continued wedding discussions over catered leftovers eaten standing up in my kitchen because the table was still covered with planning materials. "Tomorrow we're meeting with the transportation company," my mother announced, consulting her ever-present schedule. Then the invitation designer, followed by the hair and makeup trial runs. More vendors. More rearranging. More complete takeover of my personal space. "How long is this planning phase expected to last?" I asked, though I was afraid to hear the answer. "Well, the wedding is in June," Natasha said thoughtfully. "So probably another 3 months of intensive planning. But don't worry, once we get into a routine, it'll be much more organized. 3 months of living in a wedding planning command center. 3 months of having no personal space, no quiet moments, no control over my own environment. 3 months of watching my home be transformed into a shrine to my sister's perfect day while I counted down the days until I'd be forced to leave entirely." But as I surveyed the chaos they'd created in less than 8 hours, a cold satisfaction settled over me. They were so focused on their elaborate planning, so confident in their takeover of my space, so certain that I'd continue to accommodate their every whim. They had no idea that while they were planning Natasha's dream wedding, I was planning their financial nightmare. And unlike their wedding planning, my plans wouldn't require 3 months to execute. Tuesday brought the first in what would become a relentless series of financial, quote, emergencies related to Natasha's wedding. I was attempting to work from my kitchen table, balancing my laptop precariously between a stack of invitation samples and a centerpiece mock-up, when my mother approached with that expression I'd learned to dread, the one that meant I was about to be asked to solve a problem I didn't create. "Vivienne, honey," she began, settling into the chair across from me with a concerned frown. "We've run into a tiny snag with the wedding budget." Tiny snag. In my family's vocabulary, tiny snags usually meant major financial catastrophes that somehow required my intervention. "What kind of snag?" I asked, though I was already calculating how much money I had in my emergency fund and wondering which part of it they'd expect me to surrender. "Well, it turns out the venue requires the full payment 30 days before the wedding, not just the deposit we planned for," she explained, pulling out a folder thick with contracts and payment schedules. "That means we need an additional $70,000 by May 15th instead of having until June to pay. $70,000, a month earlier than expected." I felt my stomach drop as I realized the implications. "Do you have $70,000 available?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. "Not exactly," my father chimed in, joining our conversation with his own stack of wedding-related paperwork. "The house closing money is mostly allocated for other wedding expenses, and we won't have access to enough liquid funds until some of our investments mature, their investments. The retirement portfolio I'd been managing for 2 years, which I'd carefully structured for long-term growth rather than short-term liquidity. They'd planned a massive wedding without considering the timing of their cash flow, and now they expected me to solve their problem. "What are you thinking?" I asked carefully, though I could see where this conversation was heading. "We were hoping you might consider a short-term loan," my mother said with that bright smile she used when asking for favors. "Just to bridge the gap until we can access our other funds. Maybe 40 or 50,000? We'd pay you back with interest, of course. $50,000. More than half of my entire savings account, accumulated through years of careful budgeting and sacrifice. Money I'd been saving for my own future, my own dreams, my own security." "That's a significant amount," I said slowly. "When exactly would you be able to pay it back?" "Oh, probably by the end of the year," my father said with the casual confidence of someone who'd never had to worry about making their own mortgage payments. "Once some of our investments reach maturity and we've had time to rebalance the portfolio, end of the year. 9 months without my emergency fund, during which I'd be financially vulnerable and unable to handle any unexpected expenses of my own. And this was on top of losing my house and being forced to find new housing. "Let me think about it," I said, buying time while my mind raced through the implications. "Of course, sweetheart," my mother said, patting my hand. "We know it's a big ask, but family helps family, right? And this is for Natasha's once-in-a-lifetime day." By Wednesday, the tiny snag had multiplied into a full-scale financial crisis. The catering company required their payment 2 weeks earlier than originally scheduled, due to a change in their policy. The photographer wanted his fee up front after a previous client had defaulted. The florist needed additional money for premium roses that were apparently essential for the vision. Each conversation followed the same pattern. My parents would present the new financial requirement with barely concealed panic, explain why their existing funds couldn't cover it, and then turn to me with expectant expressions. "The band needs their deposit by Friday," Natasha announced during what had become our daily financial crisis meeting around my kitchen table. "It's only $8,000, but they won't hold our date without it. Only $8,000. The casual way she said it, as if $8,000 was pocket change, made my teeth clench. That was more than I spent on groceries in an entire year. "And the transportation company wants their payment up front too," my father added, consulting his notes. "Another $12,000 for the luxury buses and the vintage car for photos. $20,000 needed by Friday." Added to the $50,000 they'd already asked me to loan them, we were now talking about $70,000 of my money funding Natasha's fantasy wedding. "There's also the matter of the upgraded honeymoon package," my mother said delicately. "Jeremy's parents can only cover the basic Italy trip, but Natasha really has her heart set on the premium villa, with the private chef and wine tours." "How much is the upgrade?" I asked, though I was afraid to hear the answer. $15,000, Natasha said quickly. "But it's our honeymoon, Viv. We'll never get another chance for something this special." $15,000 for a vacation upgrade. I'd never spent $15,000 on anything recreational in my entire life. My last vacation had been a long weekend at a budget hotel 3 hours away. Thursday brought even more financial revelations. The wedding dress needed additional alterations that would cost $3,000. The ceremony decorations required specialty lighting rentals for another $4,000. The reception venue had suggested upgraded linens and chair covers for an additional $6,000. "It's all about the details," Natasha explained, showing me photographs of weddings that looked like they belonged in magazines. "These little touches are what make the difference between a nice wedding and a truly magical experience." Magical experiences, apparently, came with a premium price tag that kept escalating daily. But the conversation that truly revealed the depth of their financial irresponsibility came Friday morning. I was reviewing my own bank statements, calculating exactly how much money I could access without completely destroying my financial security, when my parents approached with what they called good news. "We've found a way to reduce some of the financial pressure," my father announced proudly. "How?" I asked, hopeful that maybe they'd come to their senses and decided to scale back some of the more extravagant elements. "We're going to borrow against your retirement portfolio," my mother said brightly. "Since you've been managing it so well, and the value has grown so much, we can take out a loan using the investments as collateral." I stared at them, processing what they'd just suggested. They wanted to borrow against my retirement savings, money I'd been carefully growing for their future security, to pay for their daughter's wedding. "You want to borrow against your own retirement to pay for a wedding?" I asked, making sure I understood correctly. "It's not really borrowing," my father explained with the logic of someone who'd clearly talked himself into believing this made sense. "It's accessing our own money early. And since the portfolio has performed so well under your management, we have plenty of cushion." "What happens if you can't pay back the loan?" I asked, though I suspected they hadn't thought that far ahead. "We'll figure that out later," my mother said with a dismissive wave. "Right now, we need to focus on making sure Natasha has the perfect wedding. Everything else is secondary. Everything else, including their retirement security, their long-term financial stability, and any semblance of responsible financial planning. By Friday afternoon, the total amount of money they expected me to provide or facilitate had reached over $100,000. Between the direct loans they wanted, the early access to retirement funds, and the various small expenses they kept discovering, they were essentially asking me to fund the majority of Natasha's wedding. "Think of it as an investment in family happiness," Natasha said that evening, apparently sensing my growing resistance to their endless financial requests. "This wedding is going to be something we'll all remember forever. An investment in family happiness. Using my money, my security, my carefully planned financial future to create memories for everyone else to enjoy." But what they didn't realize was that every financial request, every casual assumption that my money was available for their use, every expectation that I'd sacrifice my security for their wants, was strengthening my resolve for what I was planning to do. They wanted to play fast and loose with my financial future? Perfect. Push away. I was about to show them exactly what financial instability felt like. The difference was, when I was done with them, they wouldn't have a responsible daughter to bail them out of the consequences. They'd taught me well over the years that actions have consequences. It was time for them to learn that lesson firsthand. The breaking point came on Saturday morning when I walked into what used to be my living room and found 12 strangers sitting in a circle, drinking coffee from my mugs and eating pastries off my plates, while my mother stood at the front like she was conducting a board meeting. "Welcome to our wedding planning workshop," she announced cheerfully to the assembled group. "I'm Patricia, mother of the bride, and this is our family planning headquarters." I stood frozen in my own doorway, still in my pajamas and holding an empty coffee mug, staring at what appeared to be a full-scale wedding planning convention taking place in my home. The women were all talking at once, passing around fabric samples and photo albums, making themselves completely at home in my space. "Vivienne!" my mother called out, spotting me lurking in the doorway. "Perfect timing! Come meet Natasha's wedding planning committee." Wedding planning committee. As if my sister's wedding required a board of directors, and my living room was their designated corporate headquarters. A woman with perfectly styled blonde hair and an expensive-looking handbag turned to me with an enthusiastic smile. "You must be the sister! Patricia was just telling us how generous you've been, letting them use your home for all the planning. It's so much more convenient than trying to coordinate everything from different locations." Generous. They'd made my involuntary displacement sound like a charitable gesture I'd volunteered for. "And this space is just perfect for vendor meetings," added another woman, gesturing around my living room with obvious approval. "So much better than trying to squeeze everyone into Patricia and Robert's place." I wanted to point out that they had an entire house that wasn't currently being sold out from under them, but apparently my home had been deemed the superior venue for wedding planning activities. "We're doing a complete timeline review today," Natasha explained, bouncing over to hug me like we were old friends meeting for brunch. "Everyone brought their expertise to make sure we don't miss any details." Expertise. I counted heads and realized there were representatives from every aspect of the wedding planning process. Mothers of previous brides, women who'd planned elaborate events, even someone who apparently worked part-time as a wedding coordinator. My living room had been transformed into a war room. Multiple flip chart easels had been set up with detailed timelines, budget breakdowns, and vendor contact lists. My coffee table was covered with tablets, phones, and enough paperwork to stock a small office. Even my bookshelves had been cleared to make room for wedding planning materials organized in color-coded binders. "We started early because there's so much to coordinate," my mother explained, as if hosting a 12-person meeting in my home at 8:30 on a Saturday morning was perfectly reasonable. "The coffee and pastries are from that lovely bakery downtown. We thought it would be nice to provide refreshments for everyone." Refreshments. Purchased with what money, I wondered, since they'd been asking me to fund every other aspect of this wedding. "Where did you get the easels and office supplies?" I asked, noting the professional-level setup they'd created overnight. "Oh, we picked those up yesterday afternoon," my father said, emerging from my kitchen with a stack of additional coffee cups. The office supply store had everything we needed. It's amazing how much more organized this process becomes when you have the right tools. More expenses. More money spent on wedding planning infrastructure while they simultaneously asked me to loan them my life savings. The meeting itself was a masterclass in obsessive planning. They discussed flower delivery timing down to 15-minute increments. They debated seating arrangements with the intensity of military strategists. They created backup plans for weather contingencies that included renting additional tents, heaters, and alternative transportation methods. "What if it rains during the outdoor ceremony?" asked one of the committee members. "We have a covered pavilion reserved as backup," Natasha replied, consulting a thick binder. "Plus weatherproofing for the decorations and protective covers for the sound equipment. And if the backup location doesn't work?" "There's an indoor chapel available for an additional fee," my mother chimed in. "It's only $3,000 to reserve it as secondary backup." $3,000 for a backup to the backup plan. They were planning contingencies that cost more than I spent on rent while asking me to finance their primary expenses. The vendor coordination session revealed the true scope of their logistical nightmare. They had 17 different service providers involved in this wedding, each with specific timing requirements, setup needs, and payment schedules. The timeline they'd created looked like a NASA launch sequence. "The florists arrive at 6 a.m. to begin setup," one committee member read from their master schedule. "Photography starts at 7 for getting ready shots. Hair and makeup teams begin at 8. Transportation arrives at 10:30 for family photos at the Botanical Gardens before the noon ceremony." I listened in amazement as they orchestrated a production that required more coordination than most corporate events. Every minute of the wedding day had been planned, scheduled, and assigned to specific personnel. "What about the family obligations?" asked someone I didn't recognize. "Who's handling coordination with relatives from out of town?" "That's mainly falling to Vivienne," my mother said, consulting her notes. "She's been so helpful with all the logistics. Family obligations falling to me." News to me, since no one had mentioned that I'd been designated as the official family coordinator for Natasha's wedding. "What kind of coordination?" I asked, suddenly concerned about what other responsibilities had been assigned to me without my knowledge. "Just picking up some relatives from the airport, helping with hotel arrangements, that sort of thing," Natasha said casually. "Uncle Paul and Aunt Mary are flying in from Denver, and Cousin Jennifer's family is driving down from Toledo. We figured you could handle the transportation and maybe host a small family dinner the night before the wedding. Airport pickup. Hotel arrangements. Hosting a family dinner. In the house I was supposed to be moving out of in 3 weeks." How many people are we talking about?" I asked, though I was afraid to hear the answer. "Only about 20 relatives," my mother said brightly. "Nothing too overwhelming, just a casual family gathering to catch up before the big day." 20 relatives. A casual family gathering. In my home that was supposedly being sold in 3 weeks, and that I was supposedly moving out of immediately. "Where exactly am I supposed to host 20 people?" I asked, gesturing around my living room that was currently occupied by 12 wedding planning committee members and enough supplies to stock a small office. "We'll figure out the details later," my father said dismissively. "The important thing is that family gets to spend time together. Figure out the details later." The family motto for every impossible situation they created. But the moment that truly shattered my remaining patience came when one of the committee members asked about my role in the wedding itself. "Are you in the wedding party?" she asked with polite interest. "I'm not sure," I said, realizing that despite all the planning happening in my home, no one had actually discussed my participation in the ceremony. "Oh, we decided against a traditional wedding party," Natasha explained cheerfully. "Jeremy and I just want to keep things simple and focus on each other. No wedding party." After using my house as their planning headquarters, requesting loans of my life savings, and expecting me to coordinate family logistics, I wasn't even invited to participate in the actual ceremony. "But Vivienne will be doing a reading during the service," my mother added quickly, apparently sensing my confusion. Something beautiful about family and love and support. A reading. I'd been assigned to perform at their wedding without being asked, while simultaneously being excluded from any meaningful participation. "What reading?" I asked. "We'll pick something appropriate," Natasha said with a dismissive wave. "Maybe something about sisterly love or family bonds." "You're so good with words. I'm sure you'll make it sound beautiful." They wanted me to stand up at their wedding and deliver a speech about family love and support. After selling my house without permission, taking over my home for their planning, and expecting me to fund their financial irresponsibility. As I stood there watching 12 strangers plan an elaborate wedding in my living room, using my space and utilities, eating food purchased with money they didn't have while expecting me to provide financial backing, transportation services, and emotional performance on command, something inside me finally snapped. The careful self-control I'd maintained for 32 years of being the accommodating daughter cracked completely. They'd pushed too far, asked too much, and taken too many liberties with my life, my space, and my resources. But instead of exploding in anger, I felt an icy calm settle over me. They wanted to treat my life like their personal resource center. They wanted to make decisions about my money, my home, and my obligations without consulting me. Perfect. It was time to show them what it felt like when someone else made major decisions about their life without their input. I smiled politely at the wedding planning committee, excused myself from my own living room, and went to my bedroom to retrieve my laptop. They had no idea that their family financial manager was about to give them a very expensive lesson in respect and consequences. And unlike their wedding planning, my plan wouldn't require a committee, a timeline, or months of coordination. Just a few clicks on my computer, and their entire financial foundation would crumble as completely as they'd destroyed my life. I closed my bedroom door behind me and sat at my desk, staring at my laptop screen with the kind of crystal-clear focus that comes only in moments of absolute certainty. The sounds of the wedding planning committee drifted through my walls. Laughter, excited chatter, the rustling of papers, while I opened my financial management software and accessed my parents' retirement portfolio. $400,000. 2 years of my careful research, strategic investments, and meticulous monitoring had grown their modest retirement savings into a substantial nest egg. Every quarterly rebalancing, every market adjustment, every smart move that had doubled their money, all of it done out of love and a desire to secure their future. They'd given me complete control of these accounts, full power of attorney for all investment decisions, and unlimited access to move, transfer, or liquidate funds as I saw fit. They'd trusted me completely with their financial security, because I'd proven myself to be responsible, reliable, and utterly devoted to their best interests. That trust was about to become the most expensive mistake of their lives. I started with their largest holding, a conservative mutual fund that represented about 60% of their total portfolio. With a few clicks, I initiated a complete liquidation of the position. The proceeds would be transferred to their checking account within 2 business days, triggering immediate tax consequences and penalties for early withdrawal from tax-advantaged accounts. Next, I moved to their bond portfolio. These investments had been carefully selected for stability and steady income during their retirement years. I liquidated every single position, converting decades of careful accumulation into cash that would sit in low-yield checking accounts, earning virtually nothing while losing value to inflation. Their stock holdings were next: individual shares in blue-chip companies, dividend-paying utilities, and growth stocks that I'd researched extensively before purchasing. One by one, I sold them all, watching years of potential growth disappear with each transaction confirmation. But liquidating their investments was only the first part of my plan. The real devastation would come from what I did with the cash. I opened a new browser window and navigated to the website for Clearwater Community Bank, where my parents had maintained their checking account for 25 years. Using the account information I'd memorized from years of managing their finances, I logged into their online banking system. The power of attorney documents they'd signed gave me full access to all their accounts, including the ability to make large transfers, pay bills, and even close accounts if necessary. They'd insisted on these permissions so I could handle any financial emergencies that might arise while they traveled, or if they became incapacitated. They'd never imagined I'd use these permissions to handle the financial emergency I was about to create. I began transferring the liquidated investment funds into what would appear to be legitimate financial products. A high-fee annuity here, a questionable investment opportunity there, a series of charitable donations to organizations they'd never heard of. Each transfer was technically legal. I had the authority to make these decisions, but the cumulative effect would be catastrophic. The annuity I selected had a 10-year surrender period, with penalties reaching 15% for early withdrawal. The investment products carried management fees exceeding 3% annually. The charitable donations were irreversible and would provide tax benefits only if my parents itemized deductions, which they never did. Within an hour, I'd systematically dismantled their entire retirement portfolio and redistributed the funds into investments that would be either inaccessible, extremely expensive to recover, or completely unrecoverable. But I wasn't finished. Next, I accessed their credit card accounts. My parents had given me access to monitor their spending and help them manage their payments, another level of financial control they'd granted me out of trust and convenience. They carried minimal balances on most cards, maintaining excellent credit scores that I'd helped them build over the years. That excellent credit was about to become a weapon against them. I began applying for credit line increases on every card they owned. With their strong credit history and substantial income from their recent house sale, the increases were approved almost immediately. Their available credit jumped from a few $1,000s to over $50,000 across multiple cards. Then I started making purchases. Not frivolous spending that would be obviously suspicious, but large payments to wedding vendors that would appear legitimate to anyone reviewing the transactions. A payment to Rosewood Manor for venue services, a transfer to Enchanted Gardens for floral arrangements, a substantial payment to Westbrook Studios for photography services. Each transaction was documented with vendor names that matched their existing wedding expenses. To anyone reviewing their credit card statements, it would appear that they'd simply paid their wedding vendors early using credit instead of cash. The genius of this approach was that the charges would be discovered only after the vendors received double payments for services already covered by other funds. By the time anyone realized what had happened, the credit cards would be maxed out, the wedding vendors would be confused about overpayments, and my parents would be drowning in debt they couldn't easily dispute. While I worked, I could hear the wedding planning committee wrapping up their meeting downstairs. Voices saying goodbye, cars starting in my driveway, the sounds of people leaving after a productive morning of planning someone else's dream day using someone else's space. My final act was the most psychologically devastating. I accessed my parents' primary checking account and scheduled a series of automatic transfers to what appeared to be investment accounts, but were actually high-fee financial products that would immediately consume large portions of their remaining cash through setup fees, management costs, and penalty structures. These transfers were scheduled to execute on Monday morning, the same day they'd planned to make their first major wedding vendor payments. When they tried to access their funds for Natasha's deposits and expenses, they'd discover that their money had vanished into financial products they'd never authorized and couldn't easily recover from. As I completed the last transaction, I heard footsteps on the stairs. My mother's voice calling my name, probably ready to assign me more wedding-related responsibilities or ask for additional financial assistance. I closed my laptop and took a deep breath. In less than 90 minutes, I'd systematically destroyed my parents' financial security with the same thoroughness they'd destroyed my housing situation. The difference was that my revenge was completely legal. Every transaction had been authorized by the power of attorney documents they'd insisted I have. "Vivienne?" my mother called, knocking on my bedroom door. "The committee is leaving, but we wanted to discuss next week's vendor meetings with you." I opened the door to find my parents standing in my hallway, both looking energized and excited by their productive morning of wedding planning. They had no idea that their financial foundation had just been obliterated by the daughter they'd taught to be so responsible with money. "What did you need to discuss?" I asked, maintaining the same calm demeanor I'd perfected over 32 years of accommodating their demands. "We have final vendor meetings scheduled for Monday through Wednesday," my father explained, consulting his ever-present planning notebook. "Payments are due for most of the major expenses, so we'll need to coordinate accessing our funds." Accessing their funds. The irony was almost too perfect. "Actually," I said carefully, "I need to talk to you both about something important regarding your financial situation." "Oh?" my mother asked, her expression shifting to mild concern. "Is there a problem with the portfolio?" "You could say that," I replied, gesturing for them to sit down on my bed since my bedroom was the only space in the house not currently decorated with wedding planning materials. "What kind of problem?" my father asked, his tone sharpening with the first hint of worry. I looked at my parents, the people who'd raised me to be responsible, trustworthy, and considerate of others' needs before my own. The people who'd taught me that family members should support each other and make sacrifices for the greater good. The people who'd just spent months proving that those lessons applied only to me, not to them. "Well," I said, choosing my words carefully, "it seems that someone with access to your accounts has made some significant changes to your investment strategy." "Changes?" my mother repeated, her voice rising slightly. "What kind of changes?" "The kind that will make accessing your funds for wedding expenses quite a bit more complicated than you anticipated," I said, with the same calm tone they'd used when announcing they'd sold my house. They stared at me for a moment, processing my words, and I could see the exact moment when the implications began to dawn on them. For the first time in my adult life, I was the one holding all the power in our family dynamic. And they were about to learn exactly what it felt like to have someone else make major decisions about their life without their input or consent. The wedding planning was about to become significantly more challenging. The silence that followed my carefully worded revelation stretched for exactly 12 seconds. I counted them, watching my parents' faces transform from mild concern to confusion to dawning horror as they processed what I'd just told them. "What do you mean someone made changes?" my father asked slowly, his voice taking on the careful tone people use when they suspect they're about to receive very bad news. "I mean that your retirement portfolio has been completely restructured," I said, maintaining the same matter-of-fact delivery they'd used when announcing my housing destruction. "All of your previous investments have been liquidated and redistributed into new financial products." My mother's face went pale. "Liquidated? All of them?" "Every single position," I confirmed. "The mutual funds, the individual stocks, the bond portfolio, everything converted to cash and moved into what the portfolio manager felt were more appropriate investment vehicles." "Who authorized this?" my father demanded, his voice rising. "We never agreed to any major changes." I looked at him with the same expression of mild surprise they'd given me when I'd questioned the house sale. "Well, you did give me complete power of attorney over your accounts. The authorization documents specifically state that I can make any investment decisions I deem appropriate for your financial well-being." The words hung in the air between us like a blade. My mother's hands were starting to shake as she reached for her purse, pulling out her phone with fumbling fingers. "I need to call the bank," she said, her voice higher than normal. "There's been some kind of mistake. You wouldn't do something like this without asking us first." I watched her scroll through her contacts, looking for the customer service number she'd never needed to use, because I'd always handled their financial concerns. "Of course I wouldn't make major changes without consulting you," I said calmly. That would be completely inconsiderate of your wishes and plans. The parallel was obvious, and my father caught it immediately. His face flushed red as he realized I was throwing their own logic back at them. "This is different, Vivienne," he said, his voice strained. "This is our retirement money, our future security." "You're right," I agreed. "It would be terrible if someone sold your security out from under you to fund someone else's dreams." My mother had connected to the bank's customer service line and was frantically trying to explain her situation to a representative who was clearly confused by her panicked rambling. "No, I need to speak to someone about my investment accounts," she was saying. "Someone made changes without my permission." "What do you mean I authorized it?" "I never authorized anything." I could hear the tinny voice of the customer service representative explaining that all transactions had been properly authorized through the power of attorney on file. My mother's face crumpled as she realized that technically, legally, I had every right to do exactly what I'd done. "How much?" my father asked quietly. "How much of our money did you move?" "All of it," I said simply. "Just like you moved all of my housing security." "That's not the same thing," my mother cried, ending her call with a frustrated jab at her phone screen. "That house was just property. This is our entire life savings." "And that house was my entire housing stability," I replied, "along with 4 years of mortgage payments, property taxes, and maintenance costs that I'll never recover." Natasha's voice came from downstairs, calling up cheerfully. "Mom? Dad? The florist is here for the final consultation." The florist. Another vendor expecting payment? Now that my parents' liquid funds were tied up in financial products they couldn't access without substantial penalties. "We can't deal with vendors right now," my father called back, his voice cracking slightly. "What do you mean?" Natasha's footsteps echoed on the stairs as she came to investigate. "We have appointments all day. The final payments are due Monday." She appeared in my bedroom doorway, still glowing with wedding excitement, completely oblivious to the financial catastrophe that had just unfolded. "There's been a complication with accessing our funds," my mother said carefully, clearly trying not to panic her precious daughter. "What kind of complication?" Natasha asked, her expression shifting from excitement to concern. "Vivienne has restructured our retirement portfolio," my father explained, his voice tight with controlled anger. "The money isn't immediately accessible anymore." Natasha turned to look at me with confusion. "Restructured how?" "I thought you were just managing their investments." "I was," I said pleasantly. "And I made some strategic adjustments to better align their portfolio with current market conditions." "Can't you just restructure it back?" she asked, clearly not understanding the implications of what had happened. "Unfortunately, most of the new investments have surrender periods, early withdrawal penalties, and other restrictions that make immediate access quite expensive," I explained. "Some of the positions can't be liquidated at all for several years." The color drained from Natasha's face as she began to understand. "Several years? But the wedding is in 3 months." "Yes," I agreed. "That does create a timing challenge." "A timing challenge?" my mother repeated, her voice rising to near hysteria. "Vivienne, we need that money for the wedding deposits. The vendors won't hold our reservations without payment." "I understand that's inconvenient," I said, using the same dismissive tone they'd used when explaining that I'd need to move out of my house. "But these investment decisions were made with your long-term financial health in mind." "Our long-term financial health?" my father sputtered. "What about our immediate financial obligations?" "Well," I said thoughtfully, "you'll probably need to make some adjustments to your spending plans. Maybe scale back some of the more expensive elements of the wedding." "Scale back?" Natasha's voice cracked. "We can't scale back. Everything is already booked. The deposits are non-refundable." "That does sound like a difficult situation," I acknowledged. "Perhaps you should have considered the financial implications before making such extensive commitments." My mother was staring at me like she'd never seen me before. Vivienne, this isn't like you. You're responsible. You're careful. You would never do something this vindictive. You're right, I said. The responsible, careful daughter you raised would never make major decisions affecting other people's lives without consulting them first. She would never assume that someone else's plans were less important than her own priorities. The accusation hung in the air between us. My father's hands were clenched into fists, his face red with anger and frustration. "This is blackmail," he said through gritted teeth. "You're holding our money hostage to make some kind of point about the house." "I'm not holding anything hostage," I corrected. "I made investment decisions that I believed were in your best interest, just like you made real estate decisions that you believed were in the family's best interest." "The family's best interest," my mother exploded. "This wedding is for family, for Natasha's happiness, for creating memories we'll all cherish forever. And my house was for my stability, my future, and my security," I replied calmly. But apparently those things were less important than Natasha's party. "It's not just a party," Natasha cried, tears starting to form in her eyes. "It's my wedding day, the most important day of my life. And every day is important in my life," I said, echoing the words I'd wanted to say for years. But somehow, that never seemed to matter to anyone in this family. The bedroom fell silent except for Natasha's quiet sniffling and my mother's rapid breathing. Downstairs, I could hear the florist calling out, wondering where everyone had gone. "Fix this," my father said finally, his voice low and dangerous. "Whatever point you think you're making, you've made it. Now fix this and give us access to our money." I looked at my parents. The people who'd raised me to believe that family came first, that sacrifice was noble, that the responsible child should always accommodate the needs of others. The people who'd just learned that those lessons could cut both ways. "I'll certainly look into the possibility of restructuring the portfolio again," I said politely. "Of course, there will be substantial penalties and fees involved in making changes so quickly. And some of the investments simply can't be unwound for months or even years." "How much in penalties?" my mother asked weakly. "Probably 30 to 40% of the total value," I said, "plus tax consequences for the early withdrawals and loss of potential growth from the positions we'd have to liquidate. 40%. The number hit them like a physical blow. They'd gone from having $400,000 available for wedding expenses and future security to potentially losing more than half of it in penalties and fees. "You've destroyed us," my mother whispered. "You've destroyed our entire financial future for revenge." "I've made the same kind of financial decision you made when you sold my house," I corrected. "The only difference is that you'll eventually be able to recover most of your money, while I'll never get back the 4 years of equity I built in my home." Natasha was crying openly now, the reality of her destroyed wedding plans finally sinking in. "What am I supposed to tell Jeremy? What am I supposed to tell all the vendors? What am I supposed to tell the 300 guests we've invited?" "I suggest you tell them the truth," I said gently, "that your family made some poor financial decisions and can no longer afford the wedding you'd planned." The words echoed through my bedroom like a death sentence. 3 months of elaborate planning, dozens of vendor contracts, and a fantasy wedding that had consumed every dollar of my parents' liquidity. All of it now hanging in the balance because they'd finally encountered someone willing to play by their own rules. "We'll find another way," my father said grimly. "We'll get loans, liquidate other assets, find the money somewhere." "That's certainly an option," I agreed. "Though I should mention that your credit cards are currently maxed out from the vendor payments that were processed this morning." The final piece of information hit them like a tsunami. Not only were their investments inaccessible, but they'd also lost their backup funding source. For the first time in their lives, they were completely, utterly, financially trapped. And their favorite daughter's dream wedding was collapsing around them like a house of cards. The week that followed was a masterclass in watching carefully constructed plans crumble under the weight of financial reality. I observed from my bedroom while my family scrambled to salvage Natasha's wedding with the desperation of people trying to bail out a sinking ship with teacups. Monday morning brought the first wave of vendor calls. The florist, the caterer, the photographer, all expecting payments that my parents could no longer make. I listened from upstairs as my mother attempted to negotiate payment delays with increasingly frustrated service providers. "We're just experiencing a temporary cash flow issue," she explained to what sounded like the fourth vendor that morning. "The funds are tied up in investments that are taking longer to liquidate than expected." Cash flow issue. Investment delays. The euphemisms they used to avoid admitting they'd been financially devastated by their own daughter made me almost admire their commitment to maintaining dignity in disaster. "No, we definitely still want to proceed with the wedding." My father's voice drifted up from the kitchen, where he was apparently handling his own round of vendor crisis management. "We just need a few more weeks to access our funds. A few more weeks." They still didn't understand that some of the financial products I'd moved their money into had surrender periods measured in years, not weeks. By Tuesday, the reality of their situation had begun to sink in more deeply. I found my parents huddled around their laptop at my dining table, frantically researching loan options and trying to calculate how much debt they could take on to salvage the wedding. "What about a home equity loan?" my mother suggested, though her voice lacked conviction. "We don't have a home anymore," my father reminded her grimly. "We sold it to pay for this wedding." The irony was so perfect it almost hurt. They'd liquidated their most valuable asset to fund their daughter's fantasy, and now they were discovering that sometimes liquidating assets has consequences beyond the immediate cash injection. "A personal loan, then," my mother continued, scrolling through bank websites with the determination of someone refusing to accept defeat. "We have good credit. Someone will lend to us." They did have good credit. Or rather, they had good credit until Monday morning, when the credit card transactions I'd initiated started appearing on their accounts. By Tuesday afternoon, they were discovering the secondary effects of my financial restructuring. "The credit card company is calling these charges suspicious," my father announced, hanging up from what appeared to be a frustrating conversation. "They've frozen our accounts pending investigation of the unusual activity." Suspicious charges. Multiple large payments to wedding vendors in amounts that exceeded their normal spending patterns, all processed within a few hours. The fraud protection algorithms at their credit card companies were doing exactly what they were designed to do. "How long will the investigation take?" my mother asked, though she seemed afraid to hear the answer. 7 to 10 business days, my father replied. "Maybe longer if they need additional documentation." 7 to 10 business days. Most of their vendor contracts required payment within 5 business days, or the reservations would be automatically canceled. Wednesday brought Jeremy into the crisis management discussions. I could hear him downstairs, his voice strained with the pressure of watching his elaborate wedding plans disintegrate in real time. "Maybe we should consider a smaller venue," he suggested carefully. "Something more in line with what we can actually afford right now." "Absolutely not," Natasha replied immediately. "I'm not getting married in some cheap community center because of a temporary financial hiccup." Temporary financial hiccup. Her ability to minimize the situation was impressive, considering that her parents had just lost access to their entire life savings. "Natasha, be reasonable," Jeremy pressed. "We could have a beautiful wedding for $50,000 instead of $120,000. It's still a substantial celebration." $50,000? Natasha's voice rose to a pitch that probably bothered dogs. "Jeremy, I've been planning this wedding for 6 months. I've chosen every detail, coordinated every element. I'm not throwing that away because my family is having money problems." Money problems. As if a decades-long pattern of financial favoritism and a recent betrayal of trust were just temporary inconveniences that would resolve themselves if everyone just stayed positive. Thursday brought the first vendor cancellations. Rosewood Manor called to inform them that without payment by Friday, their venue reservation would be released to other clients. The catering company followed with a similar ultimatum. The transportation service canceled their luxury bus reservations outright, explaining that they'd had too many clients default on payments recently to extend further credit. "We could get married at the community center," Jeremy suggested again, his voice carrying the exhaustion of someone who'd spent days watching his fiancée refuse to accept reality. "I'm not getting married at the community center," Natasha screamed, loud enough that I could hear her clearly from my bedroom with the door closed. "This is supposed to be the most important day of my life." "It will still be the most important day of your life," Jeremy replied with remarkable patience. "The venue doesn't change the fact that we're getting married." But apparently for Natasha, the venue changed everything. The wedding wasn't about marrying Jeremy. It was about the production, the spectacle, the Instagram-worthy moments that would prove to everyone that she was living a fairy tale life. Friday brought what I'd been waiting for. My parents finally swallowing their pride and approaching me directly about reversing the financial catastrophe I'd created. I was working at my kitchen table, the only space in my house not completely overtaken by wedding planning materials, when they approached with the careful posture of people preparing to negotiate for their lives. "Vivienne," my mother began, her voice carefully controlled, "we need to discuss the investment situation." "Of course," I said pleasantly, closing my laptop to give them my full attention. "How can I help you?" "We need you to liquidate some of the new investments," my father said bluntly. "We'll take the penalties and fees. We just need access to enough cash to cover the wedding expenses." I pretended to consider this request thoughtfully. "I've been looking into that possibility," I said finally. "Unfortunately, it's quite complicated." "How complicated?" my mother asked, though her expression suggested she was afraid to hear the answer. "Well, the annuity has a 10-year surrender period, with penalties starting at 15% and decreasing over time," I explained. "The bond funds have early withdrawal fees of 8% plus tax consequences, and some of the charitable donations simply can't be reversed." "Charitable donations?" My father's voice cracked. "You donated our money to charity?" "Several organizations," I confirmed. "The American Cancer Society, Doctors Without Borders, the local food bank. All very worthy causes that I felt aligned with your values of helping others." The irony wasn't lost on any of us. I donated their money to organizations that actually helped people in need, while they'd planned to spend the same amount on a single day of personal celebration. "How much?" my mother whispered. "How much did you donate?" "About $50,000, I said. "The tax benefits will be excellent, assuming you itemize deductions this year." $50,000. Gone forever. Donated to causes they'd never supported, creating tax benefits they'd never use because they'd never had enough deductions to itemize. "Even with the penalties and fees," my father said desperately, "we should still be able to recover enough for a smaller wedding." "Theoretically, yes," I agreed. "Though you should be aware that liquidating the remaining investments quickly would probably cost you another $100,000 in penalties and lost growth potential." $100,000. The number hit them like a physical blow. They were looking at losing nearly half of their retirement savings to recover funds for a wedding that had already been partially canceled due to vendor defections. "There has to be another way," my mother said, her voice barely above a whisper. "There is," I said calmly. "You could scale back the wedding to match your actual available resources. Community centers rent for a few $100s. Small restaurants can cater intimate celebrations for reasonable prices. Local DJs cost a fraction of what live orchestras charge." "But that's not the wedding Natasha wants," my father protested. "No," I agreed. "But it's the wedding you can afford. Just like my studio apartment wasn't the housing I wanted, but it was what I could afford while I saved for something better." The parallel was unmistakable. For the first time in their lives, they were being forced to live within their means, instead of liquidating other people's security to fund their desires. As I watched my parents grapple with the reality of their situation, I felt something I'd never experienced before in relation to my family: complete, total control over our dynamic. They needed something from me, and for once in my life I held all the power to decide whether or not to give it to them. The responsible daughter they'd raised had finally learned to be responsible for her own interests first. The transformation didn't happen overnight, but when it came, it was remarkable to witness. 3 weeks after their financial world collapsed, my family finally began making the kinds of practical decisions they should have been making all along. The first sign of change came when Jeremy arrived at my house on a Tuesday morning with a stack of paperwork and a determined expression I'd never seen on his face before. "I've canceled the venue," he announced to my parents, who were sitting at my dining table surrounded by the remnants of their impossible wedding planning. Rosewood Manor was willing to refund 60% of our deposit since we canceled before their final deadline. My mother gasped. "Jeremy, you can't just cancel without discussing it with us." "Actually, I can," he replied calmly. "It's my wedding too, and I'm not starting my marriage by watching my future in-laws destroy their financial security for one day of celebration." The shift in power dynamics was fascinating to observe. Jeremy, who had been quietly going along with every expensive decision for months, had suddenly become the voice of financial reason in a family that had forgotten what financial reason looked like. "But Natasha will be devastated," my father protested. "Natasha will adapt," Jeremy said firmly. "And if she can't adapt to the idea of a wedding we can actually afford, then maybe we need to reconsider whether we're ready for marriage at all." This was a Jeremy I'd never seen before, decisive, practical, and unwilling to enable the same patterns of financial irresponsibility that had characterized my family for decades. Apparently, watching his future in-laws lose their life savings had been a wake-up call about the dangers of prioritizing fantasy over reality. "Where will we have the ceremony?" my mother asked weakly. "Riverside Community Center," Jeremy replied. "It's available for our date, costs $300 for the day, and has a kitchen where we can set up a buffet reception." Riverside Community Center. The same venue Natasha had dismissed with horror just weeks earlier. But circumstances had a way of making previously unacceptable options suddenly seem reasonable. "What about the catering, the flowers, the photography?" my mother continued, still clinging to the elaborate elements they'd planned. "My cousin Marcus is a decent photographer," Jeremy explained patiently. "He'll do the wedding for free as our gift. My aunt runs a catering business and can provide a simple reception meal for about $1,200. And we'll use flowers from the community center's garden. Free photography. Affordable catering. Garden flowers." The wedding Jeremy was describing would cost less than what they'd originally planned to spend on just the transportation. The most dramatic change came when Natasha finally emerged from her bedroom, where she'd been hiding since the vendor cancellations began. I expected tears, arguments, maybe even a complete emotional breakdown when she learned about Jeremy's practical decisions. Instead, she surprised everyone. "I've been thinking," she said quietly, settling into the chair next to Jeremy with none of her usual dramatic flair. "Maybe a smaller wedding isn't the worst thing that could happen." My parents stared at her as if she'd announced she was joining a convent. "You're okay with the community center?" my mother asked, clearly struggling to believe what she was hearing. "I'm okay with marrying Jeremy," Natasha replied, taking his hand. "Everything else is just details." It was the first time in my memory that Natasha had prioritized substance over spectacle. The financial crisis had apparently forced her to confront the difference between a wedding and a marriage, and she'd chosen the marriage. "What about your dress?" my father asked. "The $8,000 custom design?" "I found a beautiful dress at Macy's for $400, Natasha said simply. "It's not custom, but it's perfect for what we're actually doing." $400 instead of $8,000. A 95% reduction in cost for something that would serve exactly the same purpose and probably look just as beautiful in photographs. Over the following days, I watched my family discover what millions of people already knew, that meaningful celebrations didn't require financial devastation. They found a local DJ who charged $200 instead of $15,000 for a live orchestra. They ordered a simple cake from the grocery store bakery for $60, instead of commissioning a custom creation for $800. They sent digital invitations instead of custom-printed cards, saving another $1,000. Most remarkably, they seemed to be enjoying the process more than they had when money was no object. The pressure to create a perfect fairy tale had been replaced by the satisfaction of solving problems creatively and working within realistic constraints. You know what's funny? Natasha said one evening as we all worked together to address digital invitations on my laptop, "I'm actually excited about this wedding in a way I wasn't before." "How so?" I asked, genuinely curious about her change in perspective. "Before, it felt like this massive production that had to be perfect in every detail," she explained. "Now it feels like Jeremy and I are actually planning something together, instead of just trying to execute someone else's vision of what a wedding should be." The someone else's vision she was referring to was the wedding industry's elaborate marketing of perfection, but also the family culture that had taught her that love was best expressed through expensive gestures rather than thoughtful ones. My parents, meanwhile, were learning to live with the financial consequences of their choices. The house closing had proceeded as scheduled, leaving them with about $30,000 after all the wedding expenses they'd managed to pay before their funds became inaccessible. They'd found a small apartment across town for $1,200 a month, a dramatic downgrade from the house they'd owned for 25 years, but manageable within their limited budget. "It's actually kind of liberating," my mother admitted during one of our evening conversations. "No yard work, no maintenance issues, no property taxes. Just simple living." Simple living. The concept was apparently new to people who'd spent decades accumulating possessions and obligations they didn't really need. My father had taken a part-time job at the hardware store, where he'd been a customer for years. "Turns out I know more about tools and home improvement than I realized," he said with something that sounded like pride. "And the employee discount is nice." Working again at 62 wasn't part of their original retirement plan, but it was providing both income and purpose that they'd been missing since my father's early retirement the previous year. The most significant change, however, was in how they treated me. The assumptions about my availability, my resources, and my obligations had been replaced by something I'd never experienced before: respect for my boundaries and appreciation for my autonomy. "Would you like to come to dinner this Sunday?" my mother asked one afternoon, her tone careful and polite. "We're cooking at our new place, nothing fancy." An invitation instead of an assumption. A request instead of a demand. The difference was subtle but profound. "I'd like that," I said, and meant it. "Should I pick up anything for the meal?" I offered. "Just yourself," she replied. "We've got everything covered." They had everything covered. No expectation that I'd provide transportation, money, or solutions to their problems. Just an invitation to spend time together as equals, rather than as the family ATM and problem solver. The wedding, when it finally happened, was nothing like the elaborate production they'd originally planned. The community center was decorated with simple flowers and borrowed decorations. The meal was a potluck-style buffet that guests seemed to enjoy more than the formal plated dinner would have been. The DJ played music that got people dancing instead of background ambiance that no one noticed. Most importantly, Natasha and Jeremy looked genuinely happy. Not the performed happiness of people executing a perfect production, but the relaxed joy of two people celebrating their commitment surrounded by people who cared about them. "It's beautiful," I told Natasha during the reception, watching her dance with Jeremy to a song that probably cost 50 cents to download instead of $5,000 to perform live. "It really is," she agreed, her smile more genuine than I'd seen in months. "And the best part is that Jeremy and I can start our marriage without a mountain of debt hanging over our heads. No debt. No financial pressure. No regrets about spending money they didn't have on things they didn't need. They discovered what I'd always known: that security was more valuable than spectacle. As I watched my family celebrate within their means, I realized that my revenge had accomplished something I hadn't expected. I'd intended to teach them a lesson about respect and consequences, but what I'd actually done was force them to discover a healthier, more sustainable way of living. They'd learned to distinguish between wants and needs, between love and expensive gestures, between supporting someone and enabling their poor decisions. And for the first time in 32 years, we were relating to each other as adults rather than as the responsible child in the family she served. 6 months after Natasha's wedding, I found myself standing in the kitchen of my new house, a modest 3-bedroom craftsman in a quiet neighborhood on the other side of Cedarville. The morning light streamed through windows that belonged to me, illuminating a space that was entirely my own for the first time in my adult life. The house wasn't grand. It didn't have the marble countertops and designer fixtures that Natasha had once dreamed of for her own future home. But every inch of it had been purchased with money I'd earned through my own work, chosen according to my own preferences, and decorated to reflect my own personality rather than someone else's expectations. More importantly, it represented something I'd never had before: complete independence from my family's financial drama and emotional manipulation. My phone buzzed with a text from my mother. "Sunday dinner at our place? Making your favorite pot roast." An invitation, not a demand. A request, not an assumption. The difference still struck me as remarkable. Even after months of this new dynamic, I typed back, "I'd love to. Can I bring anything?" "Just yourself. See you at 6. Simple. Respectful. Treating me like an autonomous adult, rather than an extension of their needs and wants. The transformation in my family's behavior hadn't happened overnight, and it hadn't come without resistance. There had been tears, arguments, and several attempts to guilt me back into my old role as the family problem solver. But I'd held firm to the boundaries I'd established, and eventually, they'd adapted to the new reality. My parents had settled into their apartment life with surprising grace. My father's part-time job at Morrison's Hardware had evolved into a full-time position when the owner discovered his decades of home improvement knowledge and natural ability to help customers solve problems. My mother had started a small bookkeeping business for local restaurants and shops, using skills she'd developed during her years of managing our household finances. They weren't wealthy, but they were stable. More importantly, they were building their security through their own efforts, rather than by liquidating other people's assets or expecting others to fund their choices. "We never realized how much stress came with living beyond our means," my father had told me during a recent conversation. "Every month was a juggling act, trying to make everything work financially. Now we sleep better at night." The irony wasn't lost on me. In trying to give Natasha everything she wanted, they'd created a lifestyle that left everyone in the family anxious about money. By being forced to live within their actual means, they'd discovered peace they hadn't realized they were missing. Natasha and Jeremy had thrived in ways that surprised everyone, including themselves. Without the pressure of paying for an elaborate lifestyle, they'd been able to save money for a down payment on a small starter home. Jeremy had been promoted to project manager at his construction company, while Natasha had finally found her calling working as a social media coordinator for a local nonprofit organization. "Turns out I'm actually good at something when I have to be," she'd admitted to me with a rueful laugh. Who knew that having to support myself would help me figure out what I actually wanted to do with my life? The necessity of earning her own living had given Natasha something our parents' financial support never could: genuine self-confidence based on real accomplishments rather than artificial validation. But perhaps the most significant change was in how we related to each other as a family. The old dynamics of the favored child and the responsible child had been replaced by something healthier: adults who chose to spend time together because they enjoyed each other's company, not because they needed something from each other. "I owe you an apology," my mother had said during one of our monthly coffee meetings, another new tradition that had emerged from our improved relationship. Not just for the house, though that was inexcusable. For 32 years of treating you like your needs mattered less than everyone else's wants. The acknowledgement had meant more to me than she probably realized. Not because I needed her approval, but because it confirmed that she'd finally understood the pattern of behavior that had damaged our relationship for so long. I used to think that being able to handle things on your own meant you didn't need support, she'd continued. I realize now that everyone needs support, and competence shouldn't disqualify someone from receiving love and consideration. Everyone needs support. Such a simple concept, but one that had somehow escaped my family for decades. My father's apology had been more direct. We taught you that family came first, and then we showed you that you weren't really family when our chips were down. That was wrong, and I'm sorry. The financial portfolio I'd destroyed had never been fully restored. My parents had eventually recovered about 60% of their original retirement savings, taking substantial losses in the process. But they'd also learned to plan more carefully, save more consistently, and avoid the kind of impulsive decisions that had nearly ruined them. It was an expensive lesson, my father had acknowledged, but probably one we needed to learn. The most unexpected outcome of my revenge had been its impact on other people's lives. Word had spread through our extended family and social circles about what had happened. Not the details, but the general story of parents who'd sold their daughter's house for a wedding and faced consequences for their actions. Cousins had called to share their own stories of family financial manipulation. Friends had confided about their struggles with relatives who expected unlimited support without reciprocation. Even strangers had approached me at social gatherings to ask for advice about setting boundaries with family members who took advantage of their generosity. "You gave me permission to say no to my sister," one woman had told me at a work conference. She'd been using me as a free babysitter for years, and I never felt like I could refuse because, quote, family comes first. Hearing your story made me realize that family should go both ways. Family should go both ways. Perhaps that was the most important lesson in this entire experience. I had learned that revenge, when properly executed, wasn't about causing pain for its own sake. It was about forcing people to experience the consequences of their actions in a way that created understanding and change. My parents hadn't just been punished. They'd been educated about what it felt like to have someone else make major decisions about their security without their input. The financial devastation I'd caused had been temporary, but the lessons they'd learned from it had been permanent. They'd discovered the difference between supporting someone's dreams and enabling their irresponsibility. They'd learned that love wasn't best expressed through expensive gestures, but through respect, consideration, and genuine care for each other's well-being. Most importantly, they'd learned that the responsible daughter they'd taken for granted was actually a person with her own needs, dreams, and boundaries, and that respecting those boundaries was the foundation of any healthy relationship. As I prepared to drive to their apartment for Sunday dinner, I reflected on how different my life had become. I no longer spent my evenings dreading family phone calls or calculating how much of my paycheck would end up funding someone else's poor decisions. I no longer felt guilty for having nice things or resentful when asked to help with reasonable requests. I'd learned that setting boundaries wasn't selfish. It was necessary. That enabling poor behavior wasn't loving. It was harmful. That being taken for granted wasn't a sign of trustworthiness. It was a sign of disrespect. The house around me was quiet, peaceful, and entirely mine. No wedding planning committees, no financial crises that weren't of my making, no expectations that I solve problems I hadn't created. Just the satisfaction of a life built on my own terms, with relationships based on mutual respect rather than one-sided obligation. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for people is refuse to enable their worst impulses. Sometimes the kindest gift you can give someone is the opportunity to experience the consequences of their choices. And sometimes the best revenge is simply insisting on being treated with the same consideration you've always shown others. My family had finally learned what I'd always known, that real love isn't about what you're willing to sacrifice for others, but about how you choose to treat each other every single day. And for the first time in my life, I felt truly loved in return. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.